Actually, just before we get to the database error handling, I just don't want to forget to do my on-client click here. So I'll just go down to Edit Templates. Remember, I did template the command field so I can access this link button. Oh, see, I didn't mean to do that. Good example of I didn't want to add a click event for it, right? So I can delete this. However, I have to remember to go into the actual HTML source because it would have added this on click, right? Otherwise I'll get a build error saying, oh, it can't find that event handler. It's because it's looking for it from the HTML of the page and it doesn't exist. Okay. So what I do want to do here for this button, oh, sorry, I have to go back to the template editing. What I do want to do is over here in the properties, find the on client click, and put in that same bit of code, return. We put a space because it's the return value from our confirm command that we actually are looking for. Confirm, are you sure you want to delete this doctor? And put my semicolon in. There we go. All right, just wanted to do that before I forgot. But still, if I say yes, and there's related patients for the doctor, then I'll get my database error. So that's the thing we have to talk about, is how to handle those errors. There's nothing we can do in terms of validating in the web form, but we have to find out that the error came from the database. Okay, so in terms of database error handling then, just a bit of a preamble. Obviously some things can't be prevented no matter how many validation controls we might put on a page. We have to trap the errors, so although we are always happy to see those error message pages come up because they help us as developers figure out what's wrong, we don't want the end user seeing something like that, right? So we need to jump in and handle the error itself in an appropriate way. Don't want the program to look like it's crashing, right? Okay, now there are a number of data events. And I showed you the other day that even like the details view and grid view and so on, if you look in the events available, there's before and after events for things like insert, update, delete, and things like that. But they have the same group of events in the data source. I recommend doing this kind of code in the data source itself. It's the closest to the database, right? And if you have multiple, more than one data bound control working for the same data source, means you only have to put the code in one location instead of having maybe to put it in more than one, right? So go to the data source itself and you'll see it has a series of data events, sort of the before and after events for all of the action queries, right? So use the after event because that's the one that will get information back from the database. This is where the database will send back either a success code or an error message, right? So it could be the insert TED or delete TED or update TED, right? event. That's what we're going to look for. And we'll see that there's an object called E, and we can check its exception property. If it's empty, everything was good. There was no exception raised. But if there's a problem in the database, then the exception will have some content, right? It won't be null, and then we can handle it in code. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to give some message to the user. Obviously not that big, beautiful yellow error message page, but we do want to tell them that something went wrong, right? Give them an appropriate message. And we have to tell the system e.exception handled, okay? We're saying, don't worry about you showing the error message to the user. I'm in charge. I'm handling it myself, right? Those are the two key things we need to do, okay? So obviously we'll need some kind of a label or something to show feedback to the user, to show them some sort of a message. And, you know, obviously that would stay there once it was put there because of the stateful nature of a web form. So we need to make sure we clear it out. The best place usually to do that is just in the page load event so that, you know, after we fix the problem or whatever, the error message doesn't stay on the screen forever. Okay. So just as an example, right, it might be look something like this, okay? the deleted event of a data source control, we might put something like this. You might have this SQL source status event argument, the letter E. And what we can do is check, is E.exception not equal to null? If it's null, that's good, right? That means there was no exception. But if it's not equal to null, then something went wrong. So if we're 99.99% confident there's only one thing in the database that really could go wrong, right? Then we can just say for the message to the user, something like error deleting team, there are players on the team, right? Assuming there's a one-to-many relationship here. Or in our case, error deleting the doctor, there are patients assigned to the doctor, something like that. Alternatively, we can actually access the message coming back from the database, right? But again, you wouldn't want to show that to the user because we've seen it's very cryptic, very, text speak sort of an error message, right? It would just scare the end user to see something like that. So we'll give some kind of a message to the user by setting the text property of our label, right, to that. And then we'll also make sure that exception handled is set to true, right? By the way, this else if, assuming we might have a concurrency control, so some other user might have been changed in the same record, then we could also check for the number of affected rows. If there wasn't an error, but we didn't actually affect any rows, then odds are that it's because there was concurrency, and we could give that message instead. Okay. So we can optionally, instead of just putting our own message, we can check the exact message coming from the database because it's contained inside the exception. And if there's more than one reason in the database why we might not be able to carry out an operation, we can examine the actual message and figure out, well, maybe it was a check constraint on a range of values, or maybe it was a referential integrity constraint, right? It could have been more than one reason why we couldn't do something. So we can actually peek in the message and find out with the dot contains, right? Often search for the name of a given constraint, and then that'll guarantee that you know exactly why things went wrong. So that's what we're going to do next, right? So coming back here then, it's the data source that actually is looking after it, right? Coming down to the properties of the data source. Okay, if we click the lightning bolt, we can see all of our available events, our before and after events for the data operations. So the one we've noted so far is deleting a doctor that has patients, right? So it's the after event for deleted. Okay, the deleting is before. Sometimes those are useful events to play around with because you can, change values and parameters being passed and things like that. But for now, it's the after event that we're after. Sorry, slip of the tongue there. So just double click, okay, and that will give us our data source doctors deleted, right? So here is where we're going to put code, just like was in that PowerPoint slide. We have our E object, right? So if E.exception does not equal null, then Houston, we have a problem, right, in the database. Okay. Now, one thing you can do, if you do want to get into, take it all the way right away to check the exact error message coming from the database, then we can do another if here, right? So if, so there's an error, right? There's an exception raised if E.exception dot message dot contains, and we can put a string inside there, right? I have a caps lock on for some reason. Then we know the exact error, okay? Probably have an else, right? So we're in this whole decision structure first because there was an exception. Now we're going to check for the message containing something in particular, and that would be a certain situation, and we can handle that by giving a very specific error message. Otherwise, not exactly sure what went wrong. So we'll give a more vague error message, right? Something went wrong. Go for coffee and come back and try again later, something like that, right? Okay, so how are we going to communicate these messages to the user? Well, usually we'll have some sort of a label on the page, right? So if I even just come up here, I can even just stick a label on, get my toolbox up here, go to standard, stick a label. Okay, I could even use my DD validator class, make it red or whatever. I'll just clear the text property out for now, no text in it. Come down here to the ID, give it a meaningful name because I'm going to be referring to it in code, LBL error, right, for my error messages. And because I'm lazy and in a hurry, I'm just going to set the for color to red. So there's my red error message, right? Okay, so that's where I can show the errors when I have them. So if we know the error, then I can say label error dot text equals, and I'll fill that in a minute, right, with some very specific message. I could actually use part of the message from the database, but that very rarely is readable to an end user, right, who's not a programmer. So down here, that's where we might give label error dot text equals could not delete the doctor. Go for coffee and try again later. Contact your system administrator, right? Those typical error messages. Okay, and we're in C#, so we got to put a semicolon at the end of the line. All right, so that decision structure was just to give the specific as possible error message, right? But in any case, before we leave the main if that there was something went wrong, we have to make sure we set e.exceptionHandled equal to true. If we don't do that, then even though we're trying to show our own error message, the user would actually still see that big, pink, beautiful white error message screen that we saw a minute ago, right? That's what prevents that from being displayed. Okay, so I don't have any concurrency to worry about with no timestamp, so that other bit of code I had in the PowerPoint slide wouldn't really be appropriate to have here. But what I'm going to do, I'm not sure what the error message would contain. I know I had it on the screen a second ago. I could get it up by just, causing the error. But another thing I can do is you can always just set a breakpoint. Set a breakpoint, and then we'll hit this, and I can examine the value inside of everything. So let me run this once more in Firefox. Get her up and going. So if I try to delete Gregory House, okay, there's my confirm, yes, okay. There we go. So we stopped at our breakpoint because we're in the deleted event. So we've already gone to the database. We asked for it to delete Gregory House, that one record, right? So I can step through. You've done debugging before. We have our little tools up here. Step into goes to the next line. By the way, step over, like if there's something that calls some procedure or method that you're not worried about that one, right? You can just step over it. It'll just execute it and come back. Okay, if you forget to do that and you're in something else, you can just step out, okay, and come back to the main bit of code you're looking at. But I'll just click step into, right? You notice that it's also F11, okay. And you can also hover over, okay. So here we see, yes, I'm into my if because the exception isn't null, and it's even showing me here, okay, the actual error message coming from the database. The delete statement conflicted with the reference constraint FK underscore patient doctor, right? Ah, well that's what I could use, okay? So down here, inside my quotes, I now know I could search for FK underscore patient. Now I don't really have to have the whole thing, right? That's probably enough. If I want, I could put it all. But if it contains this message, then I know specifically that that's what was happening, is I was violating my foreign key constraint that they're existing patients, right? So I can now give this message being cannot delete a doctor with patients assigned. Something like that. Right, so we can be very specific because we know for sure the error message contains a reference to that foreign key constraint, right? Okay, so I'll click next. Notice I was able to modify code ahead of my breakpoint, right? So we're in here, it did contain that, right? So we jump in here, we set our label, we step out, set exception handled to true, and we're done. So I can just click continue, and there's my message. So I got a very specific message to the user. Now my only problem at this stage is that's going to stay there forever, right? Oops, darn, forgot to clear that, right? So that's easily fixed though. Just come back into my code behind here. Usually the easiest thing is just come up to the page load event. Page load happens first, and then any other events happen afterwards. So I can set lbl error dot text equals an empty string, and that will just clear it out, right? If it needs to go back again, then whatever code would want to put an error message up will have a chance afterward, but it just clears it every time you're rebuilding the page. Okay, so the breakpoint just helped me see exactly what the message was in here, so I knew specifically what text to look for. So that's really all there is to database error handling, is find the appropriate after event. So if it was something that was going to be happening on an update or an insert, right, then you just find the appropriate event for that in the data source, and then put almost the exact same kind of code. If you want, and you can look for a specific piece of information contained in the error message from the database, all the better, because you can be confident that's the reason, right? Sometimes it's enough to say, well, there's only one thing that could be going wrong in the database, so I'll give my error message based on that. All right, so that's basically database error handling. So just to finish off my PowerPoint slide, right? That's what we've done. So that's good. So there's still more work to do going forward though, right? Data pound controls disappear if there's no data to show. Well, actually, I think we touched on that last week. We can just put a simple message in the empty data template, right? Whether it's a grid view, details view, form view, there's an empty data template, and we can just put something in there so it appears on the page to say, you know, no records match your criteria, something like that. Better navigation for the details view and form view. Even our doctor example we've done so far today, right? I have to page through, easy with only 3 doctors, but if you have a large number, okay, there's issues with that. Bulletproofing, right? So we'll talk about that more in the next section that we cover, and then adding additional filters besides just foreign keys, things like that. All right, that's the end of that PowerPoint, and let's just carry on. I'm going to stop recording.